James Carter, a war hero who returns home, only to face rejection at a local diner because of his skin color. What starts as a single act of discrimination ignites a movement that forces a deeply divided town to confront its past. As tensions rise, alliances form, and the community rallies together, Hollow Creek begins to transform, but not without challenges along the way. Will the town embrace the change, or will old fears hold them back? Watch to find out how one man's quiet stand leads to an unforgettable fight for justice. Comment below on how you think one person can spark change, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire. Hit the bell icon so you never miss out. The sky had begun to shift to deep purple as James Carter pulled his battered pickup truck into the gravel lot of Rose's Diner, the only place still opens this late in Hollow Creek. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a flickering pink glow over the small chroma-trimmed building. James sighed, his broad shoulders sagging with the weight of the long workday behind him. The factory had been rough today, as usual. He hadn't eaten since breakfast, and his stomach growled lowly, reminding him of its neglect. James stepped out of his truck and adjusted his worn denim jacket. His body felt heavy with exhaustion, but he held his head high. After years in the military, there was a quiet discipline about the way he carried himself. A calm dignity, even when the world seemed intent on making life difficult. But the long hours had taken their toll today, and all he wanted was a warm meal, something to fill the aching hunger in his gut. He pushed open the door to the diner, the little bell above jingling softly. The warmth and scent of coffee, bacon grease, and pies hit him instantly, and for a brief moment, the tension in his shoulders relaxed. This should be a good place to rest. James scanned the diner. An elderly couple sat at a booth in the corner, sharing a slice of pie, their heads close together in whispered conversation. At the counter, two men in worn trucker caps nursed cups of coffee. They barely glanced up as James entered. Behind the counter stood Shirley Lewis, wiping down the counter with a dish rag. Her gray hair was pulled back tightly into a bun, and she had the stiff posture of someone who had been on her feet all day. Her eyes flickered up briefly when the door opened, but when they landed on James, her hand froze. James stepped further into the diner, offering her a polite nod. "Evening, Mom," he said, his voice low and respectful. He moved toward an empty booth, thinking he might finally get a quiet meal. But Shirley's gaze lingered on him, her face tightening. She glanced nervously toward the truckers at the counter, her lips pressing into a thin line. James noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor, the way she held herself more rigidly, like she was bracing for something. His heart sank. James had been here before, different towns, different faces, but the same heavy silence that fell over rooms when he walked in. He felt the weight of it pressing down on him as Shirley placed the rag down and moved toward the cash register. Her body language was tense, defensive. "Can I help you?" she asked. But there was no warmth in her tone, just a hard edge that made the hair on the back of James' neck stand up. "Yes, ma'am. Just wondering if you have a table free." His words were careful, measured. He'd learned long ago to keep his emotions in check in situations like this. It was easier that way. Shirley's eyes flickered to the tables, several of which were clearly empty, but she didn't move. "We're full," she said curtly, her tone final. James stood still for a moment, his hands at his sides. His mind raced. He could feel the familiar sting of rejection creeping up from his chest, but he fought it back. He'd faced this countless time before, on buses, at rest stops, in shops where people acted like his money wasn't worth as much as theirs. "I see," James replied, his voice low but steady. He looked around the diner, taking in the empty booths, the silent patrons now avoiding his gaze. He could feel their discomfort, the way they shifted in their seats, pretending not to notice the exchange. James knew better than to press further. "You have a good night," he said, his tone calm as ever, though his stomach churned with a familiar hurt. Without waiting for a response, James turned and walked out of the diner, the bell above the door jingling softly behind him. As James stepped into the cool night air, he took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. The quiet of the empty street felt like a balm against the tension that had gripped him inside the diner. But the weight of what had just happened settled heavily on his shoulders, heavier than it had any right to. For years, James had learned to keep his head down, to avoid confrontation. He had been a soldier, after all, trained to follow orders, to stay focused on the task at hand. But there were no orders for this, no training that prepared him for the constant slights and humiliations that came with being a black man in America. His truck sat under the faint glow of a streetlight, the hood still warm from the drive. He leaned against it for a moment, staring at the diner through the front window. Inside, people were moving again, the clatter of plates and cutlery filling the silence he had left behind. Shirley was back behind the counter, talking to the truckers like nothing had happened. James wanted to let it go, to get back in his truck and drive away, but something kept him rooted to the spot. His hands clenched at his sides, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the fire of indignation rising in his chest. He had worn the uniform of this country, fought for its ideals, only to return home to Thistle be dismissed like he didn't belong, like his service didn't matter. James stood there, torn between the instinct to walk away and the desire to stand up for himself. But tonight, the desire to stand tall won. James pulled away from the diner, driving the short distance to his home on the outskirts of Hollow Creek. He sat in his driveway for a long time, the keys still in the ignition, the engine running. His mind raced, replaying the scene at the diner over and over again. Every word, every cold glance, every shift of the patron's eyes away from him. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just a man looking for a meal after a long day of work. But that wasn't how they saw him. All they saw was his skin, the one thing that seemed to define him in their eyes, no matter what else he had done with his life. James had served 2 tours overseas. He had medals that showed his courage under fire, his sacrifice for a country that didn't see him as an equal. And now, that uniform, those medals sat in a closet gathering dust. For a moment, James wondered if things would have been different if he had walked into that diner in uniform. The thought stayed with him. After what felt like an eternity, James turned off the engine and stepped out of the truck. He walked into his small house, the wooden floorboards creaking under his weight. The house was quiet, empty, the kind of quiet that gnawed at a man's soul. James went to the closet where his military uniform hung. He stared at it for a long moment, the memories of his time in the service flooding back, memories of camaraderie, of fighting alongside men of every color, united by a single cause. He reached out and touched the medals, his fingers tracing the smooth metal. There was the Purple Heart, a reminder of the wound he had taken while protecting his fellow soldiers. There was the Bronze Star, awarded for valor in battle. He had earned these, fought for them. And yet, in that diner, none of it had mattered. James' jaw tightened, and a steely resolve settled in his chest. He wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't even looking for an apology. He was just tired of being made to feel like he didn't belong in the country he had fought to protect. James made his decision. 2 hours after he had first walked out of Rose's diner, James returned. But this time, he wore his uniform. The little bell above the door rang again as James stepped back into the diner. The same faces turned to look at him, but this time their expressions changed. They saw the medals, the uniform. The silence that followed was even more profound than the first time. James didn't say a word as he walked toward the counter. Shirley was still there, but her eyes widened when she saw him. She swallowed hard, her face flushing as she realized who he was, what he was. James stood tall in front of her, his gaze steady. He could see the discomfort in her eyes, the way she shifted on her feet, unable to meet his gaze for more than a few seconds at a time. Shirley started, her voice shaky. "I didn't know." "You didn't care to know," James interrupted, his voice calm but firm. He wasn't there to raise his voice or cause a scene. He just wanted them to see him for who he was, not for what they assumed. Shirley swallowed again, her hands trembling as she reached for a menu, but James shook his head. "I didn't come back for a free meal," he said, his voice low and measured. "I came back because I wanted you to know that a man's worth is determined by the color of his skin." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Everyone in the diner was listening now, watching in stunned silence. Even the truckers who had been so indifferent earlier seemed uncomfortable. James held Shirley's gaze for a long moment before he turned and walked back to the door. As he left, the bell chimed softly behind him, and the tension that had filled the room slowly began to dissipate. But James knew the real impact of what had just happened would be felt long after he was gone. The next day, Hollow Creek was buzzing with whispers. News of James Carter's return to Rose's Diner in full military uniform had spread like wildfire. The small-town rumor mill was working overtime, and nearly everyone had an opinion about what had happened. At Bobby's garage, Tommy Barnes, the town's loudest voice when it came to keeping things the way they were, wiped his hands on a greasy rag as he spoke to a group of regulars. His voice was sharp, agitated. "You hear about that soldier boy?" James Carter Tommy scoffed, tossing the rag onto a workbench. "Thinks just 'cause he's got a couple of medals, he can walk in anywhere like he owns the place." Bobby Hall, the owner of the garage, glanced up from under the hood of a car, his brow furrowing. "Tommy, he served this country. Fought for all of us. Can't say he didn't earn those medals." "Yeah, but that don't mean he can walk into a place where he ain't wanted," Tommy shot back, leaning against the wall, his eyes narrowing. "Things have been the way they are for a reason." Bobby wiped the sweat from his forehead, clearly uncomfortable with Tommy's words. He didn't agree, but he didn't want to start a fight either. Like many in Hollow Creek, he had grown up with unspoken rules he wasn't sure were right anymore, but ones that he wasn't brave enough to question. Across town, in the quieter corners, people were having different conversations. At the grocery store, Mildred Sanders couldn't stop thinking about James. She hadn't spoken up the night before, but the guilt gnawed at her. Standing in the produce aisle, she found herself confiding in her neighbor, Alice Palmer. "I just stood there, Alice," Mildred said, her voice trembling slightly as she picked through apples. "I watched him walk out, knowing what Shirley did was wrong, and I didn't say a word." Alice looked at her friend sympathetically. "Mildred, it's hard. We've been taught not to get involved, to mind our own business." "But it's not right," Mildred whispered, her voice barely audible as she gripped the edge of her shopping cart. "James is a good man. My Henry served with him, said James was the best soldier he'd ever seen. And look what they did to him." Alice sighed. "Maybe it's time things changed around here." Mildred nodded slowly, a heavy silence falling between them as they continued their shopping. In that quiet space, something began to shift, small but real. People were starting to question, to reflect. Across town at the Hollow Creek Gazette, Emily Green sat at her desk, staring at her notepad. She had been working for the local paper for a few years, mostly covering small community events, nothing like what had happened at Rose's Diner. She could feel the weight of the story pressing on her, the desire to write something that mattered, something that could spark real conversation. She leaned back in her chair, chewing on the end of her pen, replaying what she had heard about James Carter. A black man, a war hero, turned away from a local diner simply because of the color of his skin. It didn't sit right with her. Determined, Emily grabbed her notepad and headed toward her editor's office. Howard Briggs, a balding man in his late 50s, sat behind his cluttered desk, typing away on a typewriter. "Howard," Emily said, knocking on the doorframe, "I've got an idea for a piece. It's about James Carter, what happened at the diner." Howard didn't look up right away, his fingers still clicking on the keys. "Emily, we stick to local events here. Weddings, county fairs. You know that." "But this is local," Emily insisted, stepping into the office. "This happened right here in Hollow Creek. A man who served this country with honor turned away like he didn't matter. It's not just a story, it's a chance to make people think, to wake them up." Howard paused, leaning back in his chair with a sigh. He finally looked up, but his face was etched with hesitation. "Emily, you know as well as I do that people around here don't want to read that kind of stuff. We stir up trouble, and we risk losing advertisers, subscribers. So we're just going to pretend it didn't happen," Emily shot back, her frustration rising. "We have a responsibility to tell the truth." Howard shook his head slowly. "Emily, sometimes the truth is what people want to hear." "I'm sorry, But the answer is no. Stick to covering the church bake sale next week. Emily clenched her fists, her stomach twisting with disappointment. She had hoped for more from Howard, but she realized now that he was just like so many others in this town, afraid of change, afraid of conflict. She turned and left the office without another word, her heart heavy, but her resolve unshaken. As the days passed, the tension in Hollow Creek only grew. Word of James Carter's return to the diner and the refusal of service had divided the town. People talked in hushed voices at the grocery store, in line at the post office, and at church on Sunday. Some defended Shirley and the diner's right to choose who they served, while others, like Mildred, began to openly question whether things should stay the way they were. James, for his part, tried to go about his life as quietly as he could. But everywhere he went, he felt the weight of the town's gaze on him, some curious, some hostile. He had never asked to be a symbol of anything, but now it seemed like that's exactly what he had become. One evening, after a long day at the factory, James pulled into his driveway, only to find a shocking sight waiting for him. His truck, which had been parked in the yard, was covered in angry red letters. Spray-painted slurs and threats dripped down the side of the vehicle, the paint still fresh. James' heart sank as he stood there, staring at the cruel words. The hurt was immediate, sharp, and deep. He had faced this kind of hatred before, but it never got easier. This time, it felt like a punch to the gut, especially after what had happened at the diner. The thought that someone had come to his home, violated his space, filled him with a mix of anger and sadness. He hadn't done anything to deserve this. All he had asked for was a meal, the same as anyone else. But this was the town's response, this was what they thought of him. James walked slowly toward the truck, his hand reaching out to touch the red paint. It smeared under his fingertips, wet and sticky. He felt the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders, his chest tightening with a familiar sense of hopelessness. "Is this what it's going to be like forever?" he muttered under his breath. "No matter what I do." The next morning, as James was standing in his yard, staring at the vandalized truck, he heard the soft creak of a gate behind him. He turned to see Mildred Sanders walking slowly toward him, her eyes full of sorrow. "James," she called softly, her voice trembling slightly as she approached. "I heard what happened. I just wanted to check on you." James nodded, his expression tight. He appreciated her concern, but right now he didn't have much left to say. His heart was too heavy with the weight of the town's cruelty. Mildred stopped beside him, her eyes fixed on the truck. Her face paled at the sight of the hateful words scrawled across the metal. "Oh, James," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." "It's not your fault, Miss Sanders," James said quietly, though he couldn't fully hide the bitterness in his voice. "But it is, in a way," Mildred replied, wringing her hands. "I didn't speak up when I should have. None of us did. We just let it happen." James stayed silent, unsure of how to respond. He didn't want to put the blame on her. She wasn't the one who had sprayed those words on his truck. But her words carried a different kind of weight and acknowledgement of the silent complicity that so many in the town shared. Mildred looked at him with sad eyes. "Please don't give up, James. We need people like you people who are brave enough to stand tall, even when the rest of us are too scared to." James took a deep breath, the anger and hurt still simmering beneath the surface. But he couldn't deny that her words touched him. He had always believed in fighting for what was right, even when it was hard. But now he wasn't sure if he had the strength to keep fighting. That night, as James sat in his small house, the vandalized truck still fresh in his mind, he couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of defeat that had settled in his chest. He had faced so much in his life where hardship and prejudice, but somehow this felt different. It felt like a deeper wound, one that might not heal as easily. He paced the length of his living room, his thoughts swirling. He could leave, he reasoned, pack up and go somewhere else, somewhere where the color of his skin didn't define him. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the answer. The problem wasn't just in Hollow Creek, it was everywhere. James paused, staring out the window into the night. The moonlight cast long shadows across his yard, illuminating the truck and the hateful words still scrawled across it. As he stood there, A memory surfaced, a memory of his time in the military, fighting alongside men of all races and backgrounds. They had bled the same blood, faced the same fears. It hadn't mattered then what color their skin was. Why did it matter so much now? James clenched his fists, a new determination settling in his chest. He wasn't going to let this town chase him away. He wasn't going to let them win. For too long, people had stayed silent in the face of injustice. For too long, people like Shirley and Tommy had been allowed to dictate the rules. But things had to change. And James Carter was going to be the one to help make it happen. The vandalism of James' truck spread through Hollow Creek, igniting conversations across town. While some remained silent, others like Mildred Sanders felt an overwhelming need to act. After her brief conversation with James, guilt weighed heavily on her, and she decided she could no longer remain passive. The town had always been divided, but now she saw the division more clearly than ever. Mildred walked with purpose to the town's church, where weekly meetings of the Ladies' Auxiliary were held. These women, all of them influential in the town, often held the power to sway public opinion. As she entered the meeting hall, she could feel the eyes of the women on her. Mildred was well respected, but this meeting had a different tone. Agnes Barnes, Tommy's wife, was already seated, holding court with several other women, talking loudly about the events of the past few days. "I just don't see why all this fuss over that soldier. If things had stayed quiet, none of this would have happened." Mildred's patience thinned. "It's because of people staying quiet that this kind of hate keeps growing." The room fell silent at her words, and all eyes turned to Mildred as she took a seat at the large table. Agnes raised an eyebrow, her lips pursed in judgment. "And what exactly do you propose we do, Mildred? It's just how things are. You can't change people." Mildred's heart raced, but she held her ground. "People can change, Agnes. They just need to be shown a better way. We can't sit here and pretend that turning our backs is the right thing to do. James Carter fought for this country, for all of us, and we treated him like dirt." Several women murmured in agreement, though some still looked uncomfortable. Agnes crossed her arms, but Mildred pressed on. "I'm organizing a meeting at the town hall, and I'd appreciate your support. We need to talk about what's happening in this town, about how we treat people. Things can't stay the same forever." A heavy silence filled the room. Agnes looked like she might argue further, but some of the other women like Betty Holt and Ruth Jennings nodded, showing their support for Mildred's idea. The tide was shifting, if only slightly. Mildred took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision. She was stepping into a battle she had long avoided, but it was one she could no longer ignore. Meanwhile, James had no idea that Mildred was organizing a town hall meeting. He sat at his kitchen table staring at the newspaper, which had, unsurprisingly, ignored the vandalism on his truck and the broader racial tensions simmering beneath the surface of Hollow Creek. His military medals sat on the table in front of him, a reminder of what he had fought for. He had hoped that coming back to his country after serving overseas would bring him peace, a sense of belonging. Instead, it had brought him back to a war of a different kind, one fought not with weapons, but with fear, hatred, and ignorance. The knock at the door startled him. When he opened it, Emily Green stood on his front porch, her notebook in hand and a determined look on her face. "James," she began, her voice steady, "I know we don't know each other well, but I've heard about what happened at the diner and the vandalism. I think the town needs to hear your side of the story." James hesitated, eyeing the notebook. "I appreciate the offer, Miss Green, but I don't think talking to the paper is going to change anything." Emily frowned, stepping closer. "It's not about the paper, James. It's about showing the town who you are, what you've been through. People are talking, but they don't know the full story. They need to understand the man they're treating this way." James sighed, running a hand over his face. "I'm tired, Emily. I'm tired of fighting, of having to prove myself over and over again." Emily's eyes softened. "I know you are, but I think this is bigger than just you. If you speak out, it might change the way people see things." James stared out across his yard, his mind racing. He didn't want to become a symbol for something larger. He just wanted to live in peace. But deep down, he knew that peace wouldn't come if he stayed silent. "All right," he finally said, his voice low. "I'll talk to you, but no promises that it'll make a difference. Emily nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. Sometimes all it takes is one voice to start a ripple. Emily sat with James for hours, carefully listening to his story. She wrote down every word he said, from his experiences in the military to the discrimination he had faced since coming home. James spoke slowly at first, hesitant to share too much, but as the conversation flowed, he found himself opening up more than he expected. He talked about the weight of being judged by the color of his skin, about the sting of being turned away at the diner, and the fear he felt seeing the slurs spray-painted on his truck. Emily took it all in, her heart heavy with each word, and when she left his house that evening, she felt the gravity of the story resting on her shoulders. The next day, Emily returned to her editor, Howard Briggs, with the story in hand. "You have to run this," she said, placing the typed-up pages on his desk. "People need to hear it." Howard eyed the papers, his jaw tightening. "Emily, I told you before, this kind of story will divide the town. It's not what the Gazette is for." Emily's frustration boiled over. "Howard, this is exactly what the Gazette should be for. Telling the truth, helping this town face what it's been ignoring for too long. If we don't run this, we're part of the problem." Howard shifted in his chair, looking uncomfortable. "I get what you're saying, but this is bigger than just the paper. You're asking for trouble." "I'm asking for change," Emily shot back. "Isn't that worth a little trouble?" Howard stared at her for a long moment, then finally sighed. "All right, I'll run it. But don't say I didn't warn you." A week after Emily's article ran, Mildred's town hall meeting took place. The small auditorium was packed with townspeople more than she had expected. James sat in the back, not wanting to draw too much attention to himself, but he felt the eyes of the room on him regardless. Mildred stood at the front, her hands shaking slightly as she faced the crowd. She had spent her whole life avoiding conflict, but now she was at the center of it. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice trembling at first, but gaining strength as she continued. "We need to talk about what's happening in our town, about what we've allowed to happen." The room was still, save for the occasional whisper. Mildred continued, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. "James Carter is a man who served this country, who fought for the very freedoms we take for granted every day. And yet, when he came home, we treated him like he was less than human." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the room, but not everyone was on board. In the back, Tommy Barnes stood, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression hard. "This town's always been the way it is," Tommy called out. "Why should we change just because of one man?" Mildred's heart pounded, but she didn't back down. "Because it's the right thing to do, Tommy. We can't keep living like this, treating people differently just because of the color of their skin. We've been wrong." James felt the tension in the room rise as Tommy's jaw clenched. "Maybe you think you've been wrong, but I don't see the need to stir up trouble." Before Mildred could respond, James stood up, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. His heart raced, but he forced himself to speak. "I didn't ask to stir up anything, Tommy," James said, his voice steady. "All I did was walk into a diner and ask for a meal. That's all. But because of the color of my skin, I was turned away. And it wasn't just the diner that turned me away, it was the whole town." The room was silent as James continued, his voice gaining strength. "I served this country, just like a lot of you. I fought for the freedoms we all share. But when I came home, I realized that freedom isn't really for all of us, is it?" A heavy quiet fell over the room as James' words sank in. Some people looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, while others, like Mildred, nodded slowly, understanding the truth of what he was saying. Tommy didn't respond. He simply stood there, arms still crossed, glaring at James. But for the first time, his bravado seemed to falter. Despite the powerful town hall meeting, not everyone was ready for change. The very next night, the simmering tensions in Hollow Creek boiled over into an act that shook the town to its core. James had spent most of the evening at home, replaying the town hall meeting in his mind. For the first time in a long while, he felt a small sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to shift. Maybe people were beginning to listen. But that hope was shattered when a loud crash startled him awake in the middle of the night. Rushing to the front window, James' heart sank. His house was under attack. A group of faceless figures darted around his yard, shouting slurs and hurling rocks through his windows. One figure, with a can of spray paint in hand, scrawled hateful words across the side of his house. James' pulse raced as he grabbed his phone and called the police. But even as he did, a part of him wondered if they would even bother to show up. Would they care? Or would they treat this as just another incident they could brush aside? By the time the vandals sped off into the night, James' house was covered in graffiti, his windows shattered, and the front yard littered with rocks and broken glass. He stood on his front porch, staring at the destruction with a mixture of shock and despair. His home, his place of refuge, had been violated, turned into a battleground in the war against change. The distant sound of police sirens broke the silence, but the damage was already done. As the officers arrived and began surveying the scene, James felt numb, detached from the chaos unfolding around him. The next morning, word of the attack spread quickly through the town, igniting an emotional response that no one had expected. For many, the violence hit too close to home. Even those who had been reluctant to get involved found themselves shaken by the senseless brutality of the act. Mildred Sanders was one of the first to arrive at James' house, her face pale and stricken as she took in the scene. Behind her came Betty Holt, Ruth Jennings, and several other women from the Ladies' Auxiliary. They didn't say much. There was nothing that could be said in the face of such hate, but they immediately set to work, helping James clean up the broken glass and paint over the graffiti. More townspeople arrived throughout the day, quietly offering their support. Bobby Hall, the mechanic, showed up with his toolbox and began repairing the broken windows. A group of teenagers, led by Jake Thompson, came by with brooms and trash bags, sweeping up the debris scattered across the yard. Even Sheriff Hank Lawson, who had initially downplayed the vandalism, stopped by to offer his assistance. The sight of so many people coming together to help James gave the sheriff pause. He had been part of the system that allowed this kind of hate to fester. But seeing the town's response, he realized he could no longer turn a blind eye. As the day wore on, the crowd outside James' house grew larger. People brought food, supplies, and words of encouragement. The air was filled with a sense of purpose, a quiet determination to stand up against the hate that had darkened their town. James watched in awe as his neighbors' people, who had once been strangers, banded together to help him rebuild. For the first time in days, he felt something other than anger and exhaustion. He felt hope. While the community worked to repair the damage, Emily Green was hard at work on the story of a lifetime. She had written about the initial incidents for the local paper, but after the attack on James' home, she knew this story was bigger than Hollow Creek. This was about more than just one town. It was about the larger fight for justice and equality sweeping across the country. Emily reached out to contacts she had made in journalism school, hoping to get the story picked up by larger publications.
After several days of phone calls and emails, her persistence paid off.
A well-known national outlet expressed interest in running the story, and Emily worked tirelessly to polish the piece, making sure every detail was perfect. When the article finally went live, it quickly gained traction. The headline, "A War Hero Returns Home, but Faces a Different Battle in Small Town," America struck a chord with readers. The story painted a vivid picture of James' experiences, from the discrimination he faced at the diner to the attack on his home. It highlighted the deep-rooted prejudice that still existed in places like Hollow Creek and the quiet strength of those who were pushing for change. Comments flooded in from across the country, with readers expressing outrage, sympathy, and a desire to help. James' story had gone from a small-town scandal to a national conversation, and the impact was immediate. Support for James poured in from all corners. People offered donations, legal assistance, and even relocation help. But James wasn't looking to leave. He was determined to stay and see the fight through to the end. While much of the town was rallying behind James, not everyone was ready to embrace change. Tommy Barnes, who had been a vocal opponent at the town hall meeting, was fuming. The national attention on Hollow Creek only made him more determined to fight back. Tommy gathered with a small group of like-minded men at Joe's bar, their anger bubbling over into heated conversation. We can't let them come in here and change the way we live, Tommy spat, slamming his beer onto the counter. This town's been the same for generations, and now one man shows up, and suddenly we're the bad guys. Earl, a burly man in his 40s, nodded in agreement. It's not right. They're making us look like racists. We ain't done nothing wrong. Tommy leaned in, his voice low and menacing. We're not gonna let them take this town from us. If they want to fight, we'll give them one. But as the night wore on and the alcohol flowed, it became clear that not everyone shared Tommy's fervor. A few of the men, including Earl, started to question whether holding on to old prejudices was worth the trouble. The town was changing, and fighting against that change was starting to feel like a losing battle. Harold Brooks, the owner of Rose's Diner, had watched the events unfold with a growing sense of guilt. When James had first walked into the diner that fateful evening, Harold had stayed in the back, letting Shirley handle the situation. He hadn't spoken up, hadn't stopped her from turning James away. And now, seeing the way the town was rallying behind James, he realized he had been wrong. Harold sat alone in his office at the diner, staring at the framed photo on the wall, the grand opening of Rose's Diner, decades earlier. The town had been different then, smaller, more isolated. The world had changed around them, but the diner had remained frozen in time, clinging to an outdated way of thinking. With a heavy sigh, Harold stood and walked into the main dining area. Shirley was behind the counter as usual, but there was tension in the air between them. Shirley had been quieter than normal, ever since the town hall meeting. She knew deep down that things were shifting, but she wasn't ready to admit it. "Shirley," Harold began, his voice firm but not unkind. "We need to talk." Shirley looked up from the counter, her expression guarded. "What about—" Harold took a deep breath. "About James? About what we did that night. It wasn't right, and you know it." Shirley's face flushed, and she shifted uncomfortably. "I was just doing what we've always done." "That's the problem," Harold said, stepping closer. "We've been doing things the same way for too long, and it's time for that to change." Shirley stared at him for a long moment, her defenses wavering. She had spent her whole life following the unspoken rules of Hollow Creek, but now those rules were being questioned, and she wasn't sure how to respond. "I'm renaming the diner," Harold continued, surprising even himself with the decision. "From now on, it'll be called Everyone's Place, and we're going to start treating everyone with the respect they deserve." Shirley's eyes widened, but she didn't argue. Deep down, she knew Harold was right. Things were changing, and they had a choice: either adapt or be left behind. The grand reopening of Everyone's Place was a momentous occasion in Hollow Creek. The newly painted sign above the door gleamed in the sunlight, a symbol of hope and progress. The diner was packed with people from all walks of life, black, white, young, old, sitting together, sharing meals, and laughing. James stood outside the diner, watching the scene unfold with a mix of awe and disbelief. He had never imagined that one man's stand could spark so much change, but here it was, happening before his eyes. Mildred stood beside him, her eyes misty with emotion. "You did it, James," she said softly. "You made them see." James shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I didn't do it alone." As they stepped inside the diner, James felt a wave of warmth wash over him. The people of Hollow Creek had a long way to go, but this was a start. The town was beginning to come together, to face its past, and move toward a better future. And as James sat down at a booth, surrounded by friends and neighbors, he finally felt like he had a place at the table. Despite the changes taking place at Everyone's Place, not everyone in Hollow Creek was ready to embrace the new direction. For many, the diner's reopening under its new name was a symbol of progress, but for others, it represented everything they feared: the loss of control, of tradition, of the world they had known. Tommy Barnes sat on the front porch of his house, glaring at the newspaper in his hands. The article about Everyone's Place had taken up nearly the entire front page, celebrating the grand reopening and praising the town for taking steps toward a more inclusive future. But Tommy didn't see it that way. To him, it felt like the town was turning its back on people like him, people who had lived in Hollow Creek their whole lives and hadn't asked for any of these changes. Earl, his friend and drinking buddy, sat beside him, sipping from a can of beer. "It's like the whole town's gone crazy," Earl muttered, shaking his head. "I mean, they're making a big deal out of a diner, for God's sake." Tommy clenched his jaw. "It ain't just about the diner. It's about them trying to take over. First, it's the diner. Then it's the schools. Then it's the whole damn town." Earl grunted in agreement, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I don't know, Tommy. Maybe it ain't so bad. I mean, the town ain't gonna stay the same forever." Tommy slammed the paper down on the porch rail, his face flushing with anger. "It's bad enough already. They're shoving this down our throats, acting like we gotta change everything we've ever known just to make them happy." Earl said nothing, his eyes drifting toward the street. Tommy's words had an edge to them, a kind of bitterness that made Earl uncomfortable. But he didn't have the energy to argue anymore. The town was changing, and deep down, Earl knew Tommy's fight against it was a losing battle. As everyone's place settled into its new identity, more and more people from outside the town began to take notice. The diner became a kind of beacon for those seeking a community that was willing to change, to break away from old prejudices and embrace something new. One afternoon, as James sat at a booth near the window, sipping a cup of coffee, he noticed a group of young people walk in, faces he didn't recognize. They weren't from Hollow Creek. Their clothes and accents suggested they were from the nearby city, drawn to the diner by the buzz that had surrounded its reopening. Rachel Morales, a college student and community organizer, led the group. She had heard about Everyone's Place through the article that Emily Green had written, and she wanted to see for herself what was happening in Hollow Creek. To her, it was inspiring to see a town take such steps, even if they were small, toward inclusion. As Rachel and her friends found a table, she spotted James sitting by the window and gave him a nod of respect. She had read about him, about how his quiet dignity had sparked a movement in the town. To her, James was a symbol of what one person could achieve when they stood up for what was right. Rachel made her way over to James' table, smiling warmly. "Mr. Carter," she asked, her voice filled with admiration. "I just wanted to introduce myself. My name's Rachel, and I've been following your story. What you're doing here, it's incredible." James looked up, surprised but grateful. He extended a hand. "Nice to meet you, Rachel. But I'm just one man. It's the town that's doing the real work." Rachel shook his hand, her eyes shining with respect. "It started with you, though, and that matters." As Rachel and her friends joined James for coffee, they talked about the challenges of pushing for change, about the importance of not giving up, even when it seemed like progress was slow. James listened quietly, absorbing their energy and optimism. It was a reminder that the fight for justice was much bigger than Hollow Creek, and that there were people out there who believed in the same things he did. But as the diner became a symbol of unity and progress, Tommy Barnes' frustration continued to fester. He couldn't stand the way things were going, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing his place in the town. To him, the presence of outsiders like Rachel and her friends only made things worse. They were turning Hollow Creek into something unrecognizable. Late one night, after a few too many drinks at Joe's bar, Tommy stormed out, his anger boiling over. His thoughts were clouded with alcohol and resentment, and he found himself walking toward Everyone's Place, his heart pounding with rage. When he reached the diner, it was dark, closed for the night. But that didn't stop Tommy. He grabbed a nearby trash can, hurling it through the front window with a crash that echoed down the empty street. Glass shattered everywhere, littering the sidewalk and the diner floor. Tommy stood there, panting, his fists clenched as he stared at the broken window. He felt a rush of adrenaline, a sick sense of satisfaction. But as the dust settled and the reality of what he'd done sank in, a wave of guilt washed over him. He hadn't solved anything. He'd only made things worse. The next morning, the town woke up to the news that Everyone's Place had been vandalized. It sent shockwaves through Hollow Creek, reigniting tensions that had been simmering just beneath the surface. James arrived at the diner early, only to find the front window shattered and glass scattered everywhere. He stood in silence for a long time, staring at the damage. It was a gut-puncher reminder that no matter how much progress they had made, there were still people who wanted to tear it all down. But James didn't let it break him. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves and started cleaning up the mess. Within an hour, people from the community began to show up. Mildred, Rachel, Emily, and others, each one offering a hand to help put the diner back together. As they worked, whispers spread through the town. People talked in hushed tones at the grocery store, at church, at the post office. Some were outraged by the attack, calling it a cowardly attempt to undermine the progress the town had made. Others, like Tommy's friends at the bar, remained quiet, unsure of where they stood. Sheriff Hank Lawson, who had been trying to keep the peace in town, launched an investigation into the vandalism. But everyone knew who was responsible, even if they didn't say it out loud. Tommy Barnes had made no secret of his disdain for the changes happening in Hollow Creek, and now he was the talk of the town. But Tommy wasn't interested in being the town's villain. The guilt he had felt after breaking the window only grew worse as the town rallied around the diner. Everywhere he went, people looked at him with suspicion, with judgment. And deep down, Tommy knew they were right. In the wake of the vandalism, Emily Green decided it was time to stop playing it safe. Her story had reached a national audience, but the real fight was happening right here in Hollow Creek, and she wasn't going to back down. That afternoon, she sat at her desk, typing furiously. This time, she wasn't waiting for approval from her editor. She was going to publish a story that the town needed to hear, whether they liked it or not. Her article didn't just cover the vandalism, it delved into the deeper issues that had been simmering in Hollow Creek for years. She wrote about the unspoken rules that had kept people like James on the margins, about the fear of change that had held the town back for so long, and she called out the people who were still clinging to their old ways, afraid to face the future. "Change is coming to Hollow Creek," she wrote, "and no number of broken windows or angry words can stop it. The question is, which side of history will we choose to stand on?" When the article was published in the Hollow Creek Gazette, it caused an uproar. Some people praised Emily for her bravery, for telling the truth that so many had been too afraid to acknowledge. Others accused her of stirring up trouble, of making things worse by calling out the town's darkest secrets. But Emily didn't care. She knew that change was never easy, and that sometimes the only way to move forward was to shine a light on the things people didn't want to see. The pressure finally became too much for Tommy Barnes to bear. Days after the vandalism at the diner, he found himself standing outside the sheriff's office, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't meant for things to go this far. He hadn't wanted to be the guy everyone in town blamed for holding back progress. But he couldn't shake the anger, the fear that everything he had known was slipping away. Taking a deep breath, Tommy stepped inside and walked up to Sheriff Hank Lawson's desk. The sheriff looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly when he saw who it was. "What can I do for you?" Tommy Sheriff Lawson asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Tommy hesitated for a moment, his hands shaking. But then he squared his shoulders and looked the sheriff in the eye. "I did it," he admitted, his voice low. "I'm the one who broke the window at the diner." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, letting out a long sigh. "I figured as much." Tommy's shoulders sagged, the weight of his confession sinking in. "I messed up, Hank. I didn't mean for it to get out of hand." Sheriff Lawson nodded, his expression stern but not unkind. "Tommy, you and I both know this town's changing. And I get that change can be hard. But breaking windows ain't gonna stop it. All you're doing is hurting yourself and this community." Tommy swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I don't know what to do, Hank. Everything's changing so fast." The sheriff stood up, resting a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "You gotta decide what kind of man you want to be, Tommy. This town's moving forward, whether we like it or not. You can either be part of the problem or part of the solution." When word got out that Tommy Barnes had confessed to the vandalism, the town was split once again. Some demanded that he be punished, while others, like James, believed in the power of forgiveness. James had been through too much to hold on to anger. He had seen the worst of humanity during his time in the military, and he had learned that holding on to bitterness only hurt yourself in the end. So when Tommy showed up at everyone's place a few days later, looking ashamed and nervous, James didn't turn him away. Instead, he invited him to sit down. "I'm sorry, James," Tommy said, his voice thick with regret. "I shouldn't have done it. I was angry. but that doesn't excuse it. James studied Tommy for a long moment before speaking. Anger doesn't solve anything. It only destroys. Tommy nodded, his eyes downcast. I know. I don't know how to deal with all this. James leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. Change is hard, Tommy, but we're not enemies here. We're all part of this town, and we're all going to have to live with each other one way or another. Tommy looked up, meeting James' gaze. There was a flicker of understanding in his eyes, maybe even a glimmer of hope. I want to do better, Tommy said quietly. I don't know how, but I want to try. James nodded slowly. That's a start. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable began to happen in Hollow Creek. People who had once been divided by fear and anger started to come together, united by a common desire for a better future. Everyone's place became more than just a diner. It became a symbol of the town's resilience, a place where people could sit down together and talk, really talk about the issues that had kept them apart for so long. Rachel and her friends continued to visit, bringing fresh energy and new ideas to the town. Emily's articles sparked important conversations, both in Hollow Creek and beyond. And Tommy, for his part, worked to make amends, volunteering at the diner and helping with community projects. The vandalism, once a symbol of division, had become a catalyst for growth. The broken window had been repaired, but more importantly, the people of Hollow Creek were beginning to repair the cracks in their community. But even as the town came together, James knew the fight wasn't over. There were still people clinging to the old ways, still pockets of resistance. But he had seen enough progress to know that change was possible. James, along with Rachel, Emily, and a group of local leaders, organized a community event at the town square. They invited speakers from different backgrounds, encouraging people to share their stories and experiences. The event drew a huge crowd far larger than anyone had expected. People from all walks of life came together to listen, to learn, and to support one another. There were tears, laughter, and moments of profound reflection. As James took the stage to speak, he looked out at the crowd, feeling a deep sense of pride. The town wasn't perfect, but it was moving in the right direction. The night after the event, James sat on his front porch, watching the stars flicker above the quiet town. Hollow Creek had come a long way since the day he walked into Rose's diner, hoping for a simple meal. The road had been long, and there had been moments when he had doubted whether change was possible. But now, sitting there in the stillness of the night, James felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The town was changing. People were changing. And in that quiet moment, James allowed himself to believe that the best was yet to come. As the dust from the diner's vandalism began to settle, the town of Hollow Creek found itself in a state of cautious optimism. With Tommy Barnes stepping forward to admit his mistake and James Carter extending an olive branch, the town began to show signs of healing. But true progress, as James knew, wouldn't happen overnight. One sunny morning, James was walking down the main street, headed toward Everyone's Place for breakfast, when he saw a group of teenagers standing by the diner's mural. Rachel Morales, the young activist who had befriended him, had helped organize a mural project to symbolize the town's progress. The mural, a vibrant, multicolored image of unity, depicted hands of different races clasped together against the backdrop of the American flag. It was a beautiful reminder of what the town was striving to achieve. The teenagers waved to James as he approached. One of them, Lily Sanders, was Mildred's granddaughter. Lily had been deeply inspired by James' quiet strength and had taken a lead role in the mural project. "Mr. Carter," Lily called out, her face bright with excitement. "We just finished the final touches. What do you think?" James stood back, taking in the mural with a growing sense of pride. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Y'all did an amazing job." The teenagers beamed with pride, gathering around James to snap a photo in front of the mural. For them, this project represented more than just paint. On a wallet was a symbol of the new Hollow Creek they were building, a town where everyone belonged. As James walked into Everyone's Place, the bell above the door chimed softly. The diner was bustling, filled with a mix of familiar faces and newcomers. It had become a hub for people from all walks of life, a place where conversations flowed freely and old barriers seemed to melt away. Sitting at the counter, Emily Green waved James over. She had her notebook open in front of her, scribbling down ideas for her next article. The success of her first piece had opened doors for her, and now she was working on a follow-up story, one that focused not just on the struggles the town had faced, but on the steps they were taking to move forward. "You've been making waves, James," Emily said with a smile as he sat down beside her. "I've had people from all over the state reaching out, wanting to know more about what's happening here." James chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm just a man who wanted a meal. Y'all are the ones doing the heavy lifting." Emily's smile softened. "Maybe, but you were the spark, and sometimes that's all it takes." As spring approached, Rachel and James began organizing a March for Unity in Hollow Creek. The idea was to bring together the entire community, showcasing the progress that had been made while also pushing for deeper, lasting change. The march was scheduled for a Saturday morning, and in the days leading up to it, the town buzzed with anticipation. Posters went up in shop windows, local churches spread the word, and even the high school students got involved, designing banners and signs to carry during the event. But not everyone was excited about the march. Tommy Barnes, though forgiven by James, was still grappling with his own feelings of guilt and fear. The vandalism he had committed weighed heavily on him, and even though James had offered him a second chance, Tommy wasn't sure he deserved it. The night before the march, Tommy sat alone in his living room, staring at the television without really watching. His thoughts were a jumbled mess of regret and anger, and he didn't know how to move forward. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Tommy's heart raced as he got up to answer it, unsure of who might be visiting at this hour. When he opened the door, he was surprised to see James standing on his porch, a calm but determined look on his face. "Evening, Tommy," James said, his voice steady. "Mind if I come in for a minute?" Tommy hesitated, but then stepped aside, allowing James to enter. The two men sat down in the living room, an uncomfortable silence settling between them. "I hear you've been having a hard time," James said gently, breaking the silence. "I just wanted to check on you." Tommy shook his head, his eyes downcast. "I don't deserve your kindness, James. After everything I did." James leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "We all make mistakes, Tommy. But what matters is what we do after. You've got a chance to make things right, to be part of the solution instead of the problem." Tommy looked up, his eyes filled with doubt. "I don't know if I can." "You can," James said firmly. "You just have to choose to." The next morning, when the march began, Tommy stood on the sidewalk, watching as the crowd gathered. The banners waved proudly in the spring breeze, and the air was filled with a sense of hope. As the marchers passed by, Tommy hesitated, his feet rooted to the spot. But then, slowly, he stepped off the sidewalk and joined the march. The March for Unity was a resounding success. Hundreds of people, both locals and visitors, came together to walk through the streets of Hollow Creek, united in their desire for a better, more inclusive community. The sight of so many people standing side by side, regardless of race or background, filled the town with a sense of pride and possibility. Rachel, walking at the front of the march with James and Emily, looked around at the sea of faces, her heart swelling with emotion. This was what she had dreamed of, a community coming together, pushing past fear and hatred to build something stronger, something more just. As the march made its way to the town square, where a stage had been set up for speeches and performances, James couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. The town had come a long way since that fateful night at Rose's Diner, but he knew there was still more work to be done. When they reached the square, James took the stage, the crowd falling silent as he approached the microphone. "I want to thank every single one of you for being here today," he began, his voice steady and strong. "This march isn't just about what happened to me, it's about all of us. It's about standing up for what's right, about making sure that every person in this town, in this country, is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve." The crowd erupted into applause, but James wasn't finished. "We've made progress," he continued, "but we've still got a long way to go. It's not enough to show up today and then go back to the way things were.
We have to keep working, keep pushing for change because change doesn't happen in a day.
It happens in the choices we make every single day." As James stepped back from the microphone, the applause grew louder, a wave of support that washed over him. He had never asked to be a leader, but standing there, surrounded by people who believed in the same vision he did, he knew he had found his place. A few weeks after the march, another significant change took place in Hollow Creek. Sheriff Hank Lawson, who had served the town for over 2 decades, announced his retirement. While Hank had done his best to keep the peace in town, even he recognized that his views were rooted in an old way of thinking, one that no longer fit the town's new direction. As word spread about the sheriff's retirement, discussions about his replacement began. The town was divided once again, but this time the debate wasn't about race yet, it was about leadership. Some wanted to elect someone who represented the old guard, someone who would maintain the status quo. But others, inspired by the recent changes in town, wanted a fresh-faced someone who would continue to push Hollow Creek toward progress. One name that kept coming up was Officer Nate Johnson, a young black officer who had joined the department just a few years earlier. Nate had grown up in a nearby city and had moved to Hollow Creek to start a family. He was well-liked by many in the community, known for his fair, level-headed approach to law enforcement. But Nate knew that becoming the town's first black sheriff wouldn't be easy. There were still plenty of people in Hollow Creek who weren't ready for that kind of change. Still, when the election was announced, Nate decided to run. His campaign focused on unity and accountability, on building trust between law enforcement and the community. It wasn't just about keeping the peace, it was about creating a town where everyone felt safe and respected. The election was close, but in the end, Nate won by a narrow margin. When the results were announced, the town square erupted into cheers, and Nate stood on the steps of the courthouse, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and responsibility. "I want to thank you all for putting your trust in me," Nate said as he addressed the crowd. "I know we've got work to do, but I believe in this town. I believe we can be better, do better, and I promise I'll do everything I can to help us get there." As James watched Nate speak, a sense of pride welled up in his chest. Hollow Creek was changing in ways he had never imagined, and it was people like Nate who would lead the way forward. With Nate's election, the momentum for change continued to grow in Hollow Creek. Everyone's place remained at the heart of the community, but it was no longer just a diner, it had become a symbol of hope and resilience, a place where people could come together to share their stories and dreams. Harold Brooks, the diner's owner, had been hesitant about the changes at first. But as he watched his diner flourish under its new identity, he couldn't help but hide. Business was better than ever, and the atmosphere in the diner had shifted from one of quiet tension to one of warmth and camaraderie. Shirley, the waitress who had once refused to serve James, had undergone a transformation of her own. She had attended diversity training along with the rest of the staff and had made a conscious effort to learn and grow. It hadn't been easy, but she was determined to do better. One afternoon, as James sat at his usual booth by the window, Shirley approached him with a shy smile. "James," she began, her voice soft, "I just wanted to thank you for everything. I know I haven't always been kind, but am trying to change, and I appreciate your patience." James looked up at her, his eyes kind. "We're all learning, Shirley. That's what matters." She nodded, her eyes misting over. "I'm glad you came back. This town wouldn't be the same without you." As the changes in Hollow Creek continued to ripple outward, another important issue came to the forefront: the schools. For years, the town schools had been largely segregated, with black and white students attending separate schools in different neighborhoods. But with the growing push for inclusion and equality, the town school board began to debate the idea of fully integrating the schools. The discussions were heated, with some parents arguing that integration would disrupt the schools and harm the students. Others, like Emily Green and Rachel Morales, argued that it was long overdue. James, who had seen firsthand the power of coming together, decided to attend the school board meetings, offering his support for integration. "These kids are the future of this town," James said during one of the meetings. "If we want to build a better Hollow Creek, we have to start with them. We can't keep teaching them to live in separate worlds." After weeks of debate, the school board voted in favor of integration. It was a major victory for the town, and it sent a powerful message about the kind of community Hollow Creek wanted to become. As the town celebrated the school board's decision, Rachel Morales found herself facing a difficult choice. Her work in Hollow Creek had been deeply rewarding, but her responsibilities as a community organizer were calling her elsewhere. There were other towns, other communities that needed her help. One evening, Rachel sat with James at everyone's place, her heart heavy with the decision she had made. "I think it's time for me to move on, James," Rachel said quietly. "There's so much more work to be done, and I can't stay in one place for too long." James nodded, though he couldn't hide his sadness. Rachel had become like family to him, and the thought of her leaving was hard to accept. "You've done so much for this town," James said.
We wouldn't be where we are without you.
Rachel smiled softly. "I couldn't have done it without you. You're the heart of this place, James, and I know you'll keep pushing for change even after I'm gone." They sat in silence for a moment, both of them knowing that this was goodbye. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. Months had passed since Tommy Barnes had vandalized everyone's place, and in that time he had worked hard to make amends. He had volunteered at the diner, attended the marches, and had even begun attending church with his family again. But there was still one conversation he needed to have, a conversation that had been weighing on him for months. One Sunday afternoon, Tommy found James sitting on a park bench, watching the kids play in the field. Tommy approached slowly, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Hey, James," Tommy said, his voice tentative. James looked up, his expression calm but curious. "Tommy, I've been thinking a lot," Tommy began, sitting down beside him. "About everything. About the diner, the march, the way I've acted. I wanted to say, I'm sorry. Really sorry." James nodded, his gaze steady. "I know, Tommy. You've been working hard to make things right. I don't deserve your forgiveness," Tommy said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I want you to know I'm trying. I don't want to be that guy anymore." James placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder, his voice gentle. "We all have the capacity to change, Tommy. It's what you do from here on out that matters." Tommy swallowed hard, a weight lifting from his chest. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. As the months passed, Hollow Creek continued to evolve. The town that had once been divided by fear and prejudice was now a place where people of all backgrounds could come together, share meals, and build relationships. Everyone's place had become more than just a diner. It was a symbol of the town's transformation, a place where conversations about race, justice, and equality were welcomed and encouraged. James, who had never asked to be a leader, had become a pillar of the community. People looked to him for guidance, for wisdom, and for hope. And though the road had been long and difficult, James knew that the fight for justice was far from over. But as he sat at his booth by the window, sipping his coffee and watching the people of Hollow Creek pass by, James felt a deep sense of pride. He had found his place in this town, a place where he was respected, where he was valued, where he belonged. The sun was setting over Hollow Creek, casting a warm, golden glow over the town. As James walked down the quiet streets, he thought about how far they had come. The journey had been long, and there had been moments when it seemed like progress was impossible. But they had pushed through, together, and the town was better for it. As James rounded the corner, he saw Nate Johnson, the new sheriff, standing outside the courthouse, talking with a group of teenagers. Nate had become a mentor to the young people of the town, guiding them toward a brighter future. James smiled as he approached, his heart swelling with pride. The future of Hollow Creek was in good hands, and for the first time in a long time, James felt at peace. The fight for justice would continue, but as long as people like Nate, Rachel, Emily, and the people of Hollow Creek were willing to stand up for what was right, there was hope. And sometimes, hope was all you needed to change the world. Hollow Creek's progress hadn't gone unnoticed beyond its borders. The once divided town was now being looked to as an example for others across the state. Community leaders from nearby towns visited to learn how Hollow Creek had started its transformation, and journalists from larger newspapers took interest in the changes sparked by one man's quiet stand for justice. But within the town, there were still some who clung to the past, unwilling to let go of old ways. The final battle for the soul of Hollow Creek came to a head during the last town meeting of the year. The meeting hall was packed. People filled every seat, while others stood along the walls. The agenda was to discuss further reforms that would continue the progress they had made, but tensions were high. Some feared too much change too quickly, while others believed that if they didn't keep pushing, the town could fall back into old patterns. Mayor George Dixon called the meeting to order, his voice booming over the crowd. "We've come a long way this year, and tonight we need to talk about where we go from here. We've made some tough decisions, but I think we can all agree that Hollow Creek is on a better path." From the back of the room, Tommy Barnes raised his hand. The room quieted as he stood up to speak. Tommy had come a long way since the night he vandalized everyone's place, but there was still uncertainty in the eyes of many. People weren't sure what he would say. "I know I've been on the wrong side of things before," Tommy began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of his past mistakes. "But I've learned that we can't move forward by holding on to hate. I fought against change because I was afraid of losing the town I knew. But I see now that Hollow Creek wasn't perfect, and I want to be part of making it better." There was a murmur of surprise from the crowd, and James, seated near the front, nodded in silent approval. Tommy continued, "I know some of you feel the same way I did, that change is happening too fast. But we can't go back. We shouldn't. We have to keep moving forward together." The room was silent as Tommy sat down, his words sinking in. It was a pivotal moment for the town, as someone who had once been a staunch opponent of progress now stood firmly in support of it. After a few moments, Rachel Morales, who had returned to Hollow Creek to visit and see how the town was progressing, stood up. "Tommy's right. Change is hard, but look around, look at what you've already accomplished. You've come together as a community in ways that wouldn't have been possible a year ago, and you've become an example for towns just like this one, all over the state." As Rachel spoke, heads nodded throughout the room. The crowd seemed united in a way they hadn't been before. The meeting continued with discussions about new initiatives, funding for community programs, youth mentorship, and plans to integrate diversity into every facet of public life.
By the time the meeting adjourned, it was clear that Hollow Creek had turned a corner.
The town had decided they were moving forward. Later that evening, after the town meeting had ended, James took a quiet walk through the now peaceful streets of Hollow Creek. As he passed the park, he spotted Mildred Sanders sitting on a bench, her cane resting by her side. "Mind if I join you?" James asked, approaching her with a smile. "Of course, James," Mildred said, her face lighting up. Sit. I was just thinking about how much has changed since that day at the diner." James sat down beside her, gazing out at the park. Children were playing on the swings, their laughter filling the air, a symbol of the town's new sense of peace. "I was thinking about it too," James said, his voice quiet but reflective. "It feels like so much has happened. But at the same time, it's hard to believe how far we've come." Mildred nodded, her eyes misting over with emotion. "I never thought I'd live to see the day when this town could change like this. For so long it felt like we were stuck. But you showed us something different. You showed us that we could be better." James felt a lump form in his throat. "I didn't do it alone, Mildred. It's been all of us. People like you, Rachel, Emily, Tommy even." Mildred chuckled softly. "Maybe, but we all needed someone to remind us what we were capable of." "That's what you did, James." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the sunset over the park. It was a quiet, reflective moment, one that reminded James of why he had stayed, why he had chosen to fight for this town. "It's not over," James said, more to himself than to Mildred. "There's still work to be done." "There's always more to be done," Mildred replied with a knowing smile. "But you've given this town something it didn't have before: hope." Meanwhile, Emily Green had been working on her biggest story yet. The pieces she had written for the local paper had caught the attention of a national magazine, and they had commissioned her to write a long-form feature about the transformation of Hollow Creek. She had spent months interviewing people: James, Tommy, Rachel, Sheriff Nate Johnson, and countless others. She poured her heart into the article, determined to capture the essence of what had happened in this small town. It wasn't just a story about racism or a fight for equality. It was about community, about resilience, about the power of one person's actions to ignite change. When the feature was published, it was an instant success. Readers from across the country were moved by the story of Hollow Creek, and Emily was flooded with messages of support. People wanted to know more. How had the town done it? How could they replicate that success in their own communities? For Emily, it was a deeply personal victory. She had grown up in Hollow Creek, and for a long time, she hadn't believed that the town could change. But now, as she read the responses to her article, she knew that anything was possible. The next spring, the first integrated class graduated from Hollow Creek High School. It was a historic moment, not just for the students, but for the entire town. The graduation ceremony was held in the town square, and the entire community showed up to celebrate. James was there, sitting in the front row with Mildred, Tommy, and Rachel, all of them beaming with pride. Lily Sanders, Mildred's granddaughter, gave the valedictory speech, speaking eloquently about the future, about unity, and about the lessons they had learned from the town's struggles. "We are the generation that will carry this town forward," Lily said, her voice clear and strong, "and we will do it together. Because we've learned that we are stronger when we stand as one." The crowd erupted into applause, and as the graduates tossed their caps into the air, there was a sense of triumph, of new beginnings. Hollow Creek had come so far, and now a new generation was ready to take the reins. As the town continued to grow and change, Harold Brooks made a surprising announcement. He was bringing back the name Rose's Diner. But this time, the name would reflect something different. Harold stood outside the diner, addressing a small crowd of onlookers. James, Mildred, and the rest of the diner's regulars were there, curious about the announcement. "Rose's Diner was named after my mother," Harold began, his voice filled with emotion. "She was a kind woman, a woman who believed in treating everyone with respect. But somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. We let this place become a symbol of division." Harold paused, glancing at James, who gave him an encouraging nod. "But now I want to reclaim that name," Harold continued. "This diner is going to stand for something new, something my mother would be proud of. It's going to be a place where everyone is welcome, where everyone has a seat at the table." The crowd cheered, and as the new sign for Rose's Diner was unveiled, it felt like a fitting tribute to the town's journey. As summer approached, Rachel Morales prepared to leave Hollow Creek once again, this time for good. Her work had taken her to other towns and cities, and while she had grown deeply attached to Hollow Creek, she knew it was time to move on. On her last night in town, she gathered with James, Emily, and the others at Rose's Diner for one final meal. The atmosphere was warm and nostalgic, filled with laughter and shared memories. "I'm going to miss this place," Rachel admitted as she sipped her coffee. "But I know you all are going to keep the momentum going." "Well, miss you too, Rachel," James said, smiling warmly. "But don't worry, we've got this." They spent the rest of the evening reminiscing about the town's journey, about how far they had come, and about the road that still lay ahead. When it was time to say goodbye, there were hugs, tears, and promises to keep in touch. But as Rachel drove away from Hollow Creek the next morning, she left knowing that the town was in good hands. Several months after Rachel's departure, James received a letter from her. He sat on his porch, the autumn air crisp and cool, as he read her words. "Dear James, I hope this letter finds you well. I've been thinking about Hollow Creek a lot lately, and I wanted to check in. I've been working with a community out west, and it reminds me so much of where Hollow Creek was when I first arrived. But seeing the progress we made gives me hope that change is possible, no matter where you are. I just wanted to thank you once again for everything you've done for the town and for me. You've taught me so much about patience, about perseverance, and about how change really happens. You'll never forget our time together. Take care of yourself, James, and take care of Hollow Creek. With gratitude, Rachel." James smiled as he folded the letter, tucking it into his pocket. Rachel's words were a reminder that their work was far from over, but it was also a reminder of how much they had already accomplished. Over time, Tommy Barnes fully embraced his role as a leader in the town's new direction. He became a regular volunteer at the community center, working with young people who, like him, had once been resistant to change. One afternoon, as Tommy sat on a bench outside the center, talking with a group of teenagers, he realized just how far he had come. The anger and fear that had once controlled him were gone, replaced by a sense of purpose. "I used to think change was something to be afraid of," Tommy told the teens, "but now I see it's what makes us better. We can't grow if we don't open ourselves up to new ways of thinking." The teens listened intently, nodding in agreement. Tommy's journey had become an inspiration to many, showing that it was never too late to change. 1 year after the March for Unity, the town of Hollow Creek came together once again to celebrate. The town square was filled with music, food, and laughter, as people from all walks of life gathered to reflect on the progress they had made. James stood with Sheriff Nate Johnson, Emily Green, and Lily Sanders, watching the festivities with a deep sense of pride. The town was thriving, its people united by a shared vision of a better future. As the sun set over the town, casting a golden glow over the square, James felt a quiet sense of contentment. Hollow Creek had been through so much, but they had come out the other side stronger, more resilient, and more united than ever. In the years that followed, Hollow Creek continued to evolve. The town's story became a beacon of hope for other communities struggling with their own divisions. People came from far and wide to visit Rose's Diner, to see the mural painted by the teenagers, and to meet the people who had made change possible. But for James, it wasn't about the recognition. It wasn't about being a hero or a leader. It was about the quiet, steady work of building a community where everyone had a place. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching the stars twinkle above the town, James felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that the fight for justice was ongoing, that there would always be more work to do. But for now, in this moment, he was content. Hollow Creek was his home, and it was a home worth fighting for. As the story of James and Hollow Creek shows, change takes courage, community, and a willingness to stand up for what's right. If you've been inspired by their journey, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that remind us of the importance of unity, justice, and hope. And remember, your voice matters. Let us know in the comments how this story touched you and what kind of stories you'd love to hear next. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. It's still hard sometimes, but I feel like we're finally free. Edith smiled, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel. She had come so far, and though there were still challenges ahead, Edith knew that Rachel had the strength to face them. "I'm so proud of you," Edith said softly. "You're doing such a good job, Rachel. You and the girls are going to be just fine." Rachel hesitated for a moment, then her voice softened. "We couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You saved us. I'll never be able to thank you enough for everything you've done." Tears welled in Edith's eyes, and she wiped them away with a smile. "You're family now, Rachel, and family takes care of each other." As Edith hung up the phone, a sense of calm settled over her. She had faced her fears, stood up to Derek, and helped Rachel and the girls escape a dangerous situation. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Her home, once a place of quiet solitude, had become a symbol of strength and resilience. And her neighbors' sons, strangers, had become a community, united by a shared sense of purpose. Life on Cedar Street would never be the same again, but that was okay. Because now it is filled with hope, connection, and the promise of a better future. Edith smiled as she stepped out into her garden, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the roses. She knelt down, her hands gently tending to the flowers, feeling the cool earth beneath her fingertips. There was still work to be done, but now she knew she wasn't doing it alone. In the weeks that followed Derek's final confrontation, a new sense of peace settled over Cedar Street. The neighborhood watch remained vigilant, but the need for constant worry had lessened as Derek's presence faded from their lives. He hadn't returned, and the restraining order kept him at a safe distance from Edith's home and from the shelter where Rachel and the girls were living. Edith found herself breathing easier with each passing day, the weight of fear slowly lifting from her shoulders. One crisp autumn morning, as Edith was pruning her roses, she heard the familiar ring of her phone from inside the house. She wiped her hands on her gardening apron and hurried to answer it. her heart lifting when she saw Rachel's name on the caller ID. "Rachel, it's so good to hear from you," Edith said, a smile spreading across her face as she held the phone to her ear. "Hi, Edith," Rachel replied, her voice filled with warmth. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all, dear. Just tending to the garden. How are you and the girls doing?" Rachel let out a small sigh, though it was one of relief rather than stress. "We're doing really well, actually. The girls are starting to settle in at school, and they're making new friends. We've been staying at the shelter for a while now, but I've been working with a caseworker. And, well, we found a place. It's a small apartment, but it's ours." Edith's heart swelled with joy at the news. "Rachel, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you. I couldn't have done it without your help, Edith." "Really? I mean it. You were there for me when I didn't know what to do. I'll never be able to thank you enough." "You've already thanked me more than enough, Rachel," Edith said gently. "I'm just glad you and the girls are safe and moving forward." "We are," Rachel agreed, her voice steady. "We still have some hard days, but we're starting to rebuild. I'm learning how to live without looking over my shoulder all the time. The girls, they've been through so much, but I think they're going to be okay." Edith felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she wiped it away with a smile. "You're an incredible mother, Rachel. You've given them the chance to have a better life, and that's the most important thing." "Thank you," Rachel whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I wanted to ask, would you like to come visit us when we're settled into the apartment? The girls miss you, and I'd love for you to see our new place." "I'd love that," Edith replied without hesitation. "I can't wait to see how far you've come." After they said their goodbyes, Edith stood in the quiet of her kitchen, a deep sense of pride and peace settling over her. She had been part of something important, helping Rachel and her daughters escape a dangerous situation and start a new life. Knowing that they were safe and thriving gave Edith a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in a long time. But Edith also knew that healing wasn't just for Rachel and the girls. She, too, had been deeply affected by everything that had happened. For so long, Edith had lived in a world of solitude, wrapped in the memories of her past life with Richard. But now she realized that she had the power to create new connections, to make a difference in the lives of others. Her small, quiet world had expanded in ways she never could have predicted. A few weeks later, Edith stood in front of the door to Rachel's new apartment, her heart racing with anticipation. She held a basket filled with homemade cookies and a small potted plant, a housewarming gift for Rachel and the girls. As she knocked on the door, she couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement and pride. Rachel had taken such brave steps toward building a new life for herself and her daughters, and Edith was eager to see the progress they had made. The door opened, and there stood Rachel, her face lighting up with a wide smile. "Edith, you made it." "Of course I did," Edith replied warmly, stepping inside and hugging Rachel. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." The apartment was small but cozy, filled with the warmth and light that Edith had come to associate with Rachel. The walls were adorned with colorful artwork, some drawn by Lily and Ivy, and the space felt alive with the energy of a family building something new. Edith smiled as she took it all in, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel's resilience. "Look who's here!" Rachel called out. And moments later, Lily and Ivy came bounding into the room, their faces bright with excitement. "Grandma Edith!" they exclaimed in unison, rushing toward her and wrapping their arms around her. Edith laughed, bending down to hug the girls. "Oh, my dears, it's so good to see you." "We missed you," Ivy said, her voice small but filled with warmth. "Can you stay for dinner?" "I wouldn't dream of leaving before dinner," Edith replied, her heart swelling with affection for the girls. As they settled into the living room, Rachel brought out a pot of tea, and the four of them spent the afternoon catching up, laughing, and sharing stories. The girls proudly showed Edith their artwork, and Rachel talked about how they were adjusting to their new school and making friends. "They're doing so well," Rachel said, her voice filled with relief and pride. "I wasn't sure how they would handle all the changes, but they've been so strong. I'm so proud of them." "You should be proud of yourself too," Edith said gently. "You've created a safe, loving home for them. That's everything." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with tears of gratitude. I still can't believe we made it. There were times when I thought we'd never get out, but now we have a chance at a real life." As the afternoon turned into evening, the conversation grew deeper, and Edith and Rachel found themselves reflecting on everything that had happened over the past few months. There had been so much pain, fear, and uncertainty, but now there was also hope. They had made it through the storm, and now they were standing on the other side, ready to rebuild their lives. "I never thought I'd feel free," Rachel admitted quietly, her voice heavy with emotion. "But now I wake up every morning knowing that I'm safe, that my girls are safe. And that's everything." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "You deserve this peace, Rachel. You and the girls deserve all the happiness in the world." Rachel nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "And you deserve it too, Edith. You've been through so much yourself. You've given us a new start, and I hope you know how much that means to me." Edith smiled, her heart full. "We've given each other a new start." Later that evening, after dinner and one last round of hugs from Lily and Ivy, Edith said her goodbyes and made her way back to her own home. As she walked down the quiet street, she felt a deep sense of contentment. Life had changed in ways she never could have predicted, but it was better, now richer, fuller, and filled with new connections. Rachel and the girls had become like family to her, and Edith knew that their bond would only grow stronger as they continued to support one another in the days ahead. As the autumn leaves began to fall and the air turned crisp, Edith found herself spending more time in her garden, reflecting on the past few months. So much had changed, not just for Rachel and the girls, but for Edith as well. Her life, once quiet and isolated, had been transformed by the relationships she had built and the strength she had discovered within herself. But with that transformation came a deeper understanding of the weight she had been carrying for so long: grief, the loneliness, the sense of being left behind. Richard's death had left a hole in Edith's life, one that she had tried to fill with routine and solitude. But now, with Rachel and the girls in her life, Edith realized that she didn't have to carry that weight alone anymore. One afternoon, as Edith sat in the garden with a cup of tea, she found herself thinking about Richard. She missed him every day, missed his laugh, his warmth, the way he had always made her feel safe and loved. But for the first time in a long time, Edith felt a sense of peace when she thought of him, peace in knowing that he would have been proud of her for everything she had done to help Rachel and the girls. As she sipped her tea, Edith decided it was time to visit Richard's grave. She hadn't been in a while, and she felt a strong pull to go to tell him about everything that had happened, about the new life she had found after all these years. The next day, Edith drove to the cemetery where Richard was buried. The drive was quiet, the fall colors painting the landscape in shades of gold and red. When she arrived, Edith made her way to Richard's headstone, a small smile on her face as she placed a bouquet of fresh roses at his grave. "Hello, love," she said softly, her voice filled with affection. "It's been a while, but I've been busy. I have so much to tell you." For the next hour, Edith sat by Richard's grave, telling him about Rachel, about the girls, about everything that had happened since they had moved into the neighborhood. She talked about how she had found new strength within herself, how she had made new friends, and how she had learned that it was never too late to make a difference in someone's life. "I think you'd be proud of me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I've still got a lot of life left to live, and I'm going to make the most of it. I'll carry your love with me, always." As Edith stood to leave, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She knew that Richard was still with her, in spirit, and that his love would continue to guide her in the days ahead. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. As the winter holidays approached, Cedar Street came alive with the warm glow of twinkling lights and the festive spirit of the season. Edith, who had once dreaded the long, lonely winter months, now found herself filled with a sense of anticipation and joy. The neighborhood had changed so much in the past few months, and Edith felt more connected to her community than ever before. Rachel and the girls had invited Edith to spend Christmas with them in their new apartment, and Edith had gladly accepted. It was a far cry from the quiet, solitary holidays she had spent in years past, and she was looking forward to celebrating with people she cared about. On Christmas Eve, Edith arrived at Rachel's apartment with a basket full of gifts and homemade treats. The girls greeted her at the door, their faces bright with excitement, and Edith couldn't help but laugh as they pulled her inside. "We've been waiting for you," Lily exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with joy. Mom made hot chocolate. Edith's heart swelled with affection as she followed the girls into the cozy living room where Rachel was waiting with a warm smile. The apartment was decorated with twinkling lights and a small Christmas tree, and the air was filled with the comforting scent of cinnamon and pine. "Welcome, Edith," Rachel said, hugging her tightly. "We're so glad you're here." "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else," Edith replied, her voice full of warmth. As they sat together by the fire, sipping hot chocolate and exchanging stories, Edith felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what she had been missing for so long, a sense of connection, of belonging, of family. The evening passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and warmth. The girls opened their presents with wide-eyed excitement, and Edith marveled at how far they had come since the dark days of living under Derek's control. They were happy, healthy, and full of life, and Edith knew that Rachel had done an incredible job of creating a safe, loving home for them. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Rachel and Edith sat together by the fire, reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. "It feels like a lifetime ago," Rachel said quietly, her eyes focused on the flickering flames. "Sometimes I still can't believe we made it out." "But we did." "You did," Edith corrected gently. "You found the strength to leave, and now you and the girls have a bright future ahead of you." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You were there when I needed someone the most, and I'll never forget that." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "We've been there for each other, and we'll keep being there, no matter what comes next." As they sat together in the quiet of the night, Edith felt a deep sense of peace settling over her. The storm was over, and now it was time to move forward to embrace the future with open arms, knowing that they had all found the strength to survive and thrive. And in that moment, Edith knew that everything would be all right. Thank you for following along with Edith's emotional and inspiring journey. If you found this story moving or relatable, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more powerful stories like this. We'll be bringing you more heartwarming tales of resilience, community, and the strength of the human spirit. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you'll always be the first to know when new content is available. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.